It just ain't feasible, Mr. Apples. Once upon a time, in a small town called Maryville, lived a man named Mr. Apples. Now, Mr. Apples was not your ordinary man, for he had a peculiar hobby. He loved to ask himself the question, would it be feasible, and then try to find the answer. No matter how absurd the question was. He would often spend hours trying to figure out the answer to these ridiculous questions, much to the amusement of his neighbors. One day, Mr. Apples woke up with a new question on his mind. Would it be feasible to fly with the help of helium balloons, he wondered. He quickly got out of bed and went to the store to buy a few helium balloons. Once he had enough balloons, he tied them to his waist and began to rise into the air. At first, Mr. Apples was thrilled at the feeling of flying. But as he rose higher and higher, he realized that he had made a mistake. He had not tied the balloons securely enough, and they began to come loose. Suddenly, Mr. Apples found himself hurtling towards the ground. Luckily, he landed in a nearby pond and was unharmed. But the incident taught him a valuable lesson. Just because something seems feasible, doesn't mean it's a good idea. Undeterred by his close call, Mr. Apples continued to ask himself absurd questions. Would it be feasible to train a cat to do tricks, he wondered. So he went to the animal shelter and adopted a cat. At first, the cat was uninterested in Mr. Apples' attempts to train her. But with patience and perseverance, he eventually managed to teach her to jump through hoops and balance on a ball. Mr. Apples was overjoyed with his success, but he soon realized that he had made another mistake. He had forgotten that cats are notoriously independent creatures. The cat had only learned the tricks because she wanted the treats he gave her as a reward. Once she had had enough treats, she refused to perform the tricks anymore. This experience taught Mr. Apples another valuable lesson. Just because something is feasible doesn't mean it's worth the effort. Still undeterred, Mr. Apples continued to ask himself ridiculous questions. Would it be feasible to make a cake without using any sugar, he wondered. So he set about experimenting with different ingredients and recipes. The first cake he made was so terrible that even the birds wouldn't eat it. But Mr. Apples refused to give up. He kept trying different recipes and ingredients until he finally made a cake that was not only sugar-free but also delicious. Mr. Apples was thrilled with his success. But he soon realized that he had made yet another mistake. He had forgotten that just because something is feasible, doesn't mean it's a good idea. The sugar-free cake had caused him and his guests to suffer from severe digestive problems. And they spent the rest of the evening in the bathroom. From that day on, Mr. Apples vowed never to experiment with food again. Finally, Mr. Apples learned his most important lesson yet. Feasibility is not the same as common sense. Just because something is technically possible doesn't mean it's a good idea. From that day on, Mr. Apples lived a simpler life. He gave up his absurd hobbies and instead focused on the things that truly mattered, like spending time with his friends and family. And whenever he found himself wondering, would it be feasible, he stopped and asked himself, is it worth it? Funny poem, It Just Ain't Feasible by Reuben White. Oh, let me tell you of some crazy schemes that people have dreamed up in their wildest dreams. Some are wacky, some are wild, and most of them are just too mild. One man thought he could fly with a broom, but soon found out he was doomed. Another tried to make a car that could swim, but ended up in a terrible trim. There was a guy who wanted to build a house on the moon, but sadly, his plans were just a cartoon. And someone thought they could live without sleep, but they soon found out it made them weep. Some people think they can talk to animals, but sadly, they end up in a pickle, and others believe they can control the weather, but their attempts just make us all shiver. So if you have a crazy idea, and you think it's something to cheer, just remember, it may not be feasible, and you might end up looking quite unreasonable.